the big reason why there's a war happening in Ukraine is because NATO would not stop expanding towards Russia's border, which we promised we would do after Germany was allowed to reunify East and West. So there was a promise to Russia made that we won't expand NATO, and then we've been expanding NATO like crazy. And the threat of putting Ukraine, which is on Russia's border, into NATO was part of what triggered this Ukraine war. We have been provoking the Ukraine war, just so you know. And so now it seems like we're going to keep doing it. We're going to keep provoking a war with a nuclear power. And this is from the New York Times. It says NATO leaders say they will speed Finland and Sweden membership bids. That's what they say. The head of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that's NATO, said Sunday that the security bloc would grant fast-track membership to Sweden and Finland, raising pressures on Putin, who justified his invasion of Ukraine by what he cast as the need to keep the military alliance away from Russia's borders. President Putin wants Ukraine defeated, NATO down, North America and Europe divided, said NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in Berlin after meeting foreign ministers. But Ukraine stands. NATO is stronger than ever. Europe and North America are solidly united. Okay. Both countries said their applications were imminent to NATO. Finland's parliament is expected to ratify a NATO application on Monday. That's today. And Sweden's governing Social Democratic Party said Sunday that it would vote in favor of joining NATO, all but guaranteeing that the Nordic nation would end 200 years of neutrality. The possibility of NATO troops deploying along Russia's 810-mile border with Finland comes as Mr. Putin is facing notable setbacks in the war he began in Ukraine nearly 3 months ago. I don't think that's true, New York Times. Ukraine forces have advanced to near the Russian border in recent days after pushing Russian troops from the outskirts of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Many Russians believe the war is no longer against Ukraine, but has morphed into a proxy conflict with the United States and NATO. You think? Who, they say, are exploiting the conflict to destroy their nation, according to interviews with a half dozen residents in Moscow and the provincial Siberia. Also, anybody who knows anything about anything will tell you that. The decision of Finland and Sweden to apply to join NATO has only played into the siege narrative pushed by the Kremlin, tapping into patriotic feelings in a nation that prides itself on coming together to repel foreign threats over centuries. John Pilger says, this week, 15,000 U.S.-led troops will simulate a NATO war with Russia less than 100 miles from St. Petersburg. Imagine the same provocation 100 miles from nuclear-armed Washington. And here's what I like. Our friend Nick Cruz says, according to the West, Russia is struggling in Ukraine as the military is exposed as weak and ineffective. But Sweden and Finland must join NATO to stop the giant Russian threat from taking over Europe. People are so propagandized they don't realize how this makes no sense. So that's Aaron. Let me bring in Aaron Mate, award-winning anti-war journalist who can be found at mate.substack.com. Aaron, what's your response to this latest NATO move?
Nick Cruz has it exactly right. On the one hand, we're supposed to believe, which is true actually, that Russia has had a hard time in Ukraine. They have. But yet also, Russia is then poised to take over the rest of Europe, and that's why Finland and Sweden need to join NATO. Look, Jimmy, this is a crazy time. We talked about earlier, every member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus is voting in lockstep with the neocons and approving billions of dollars more for a proxy war that will primarily benefit the weapons industry and primarily arm neo-Nazis inside Ukraine, because that's who will get these weapons, at least some of them. And now we have Finland and Sweden, which have prospered under neutrality. It's been great for them, as far as I know, unless someone wants to argue otherwise, deciding to abandon all of that for the sake of what? Just further provoking Russia. And this means that every society is going to get worse. Russia will get worse because this will require Russia to spend even more on its military. Russia's military budget is about 8% of the rest of NATO's, about 8%. So now Russia is going to be increasingly militarized. That's bad for the Russian people because militarization is bad for everybody, especially those who have to live under it. And it means that all these other societies are going to spend more on weapons too, because that's what NATO membership requires, is that you basically hand over your national budget to the arms manufacturers, especially arms manufacturers in the United States. So this is a disaster. And for what? And it could actually mean that we have new fronts, because what is Russia going to do? Russia's already threatened that it might take measures in response to Finland joining NATO, because Finland is on its borders. So, and what that could mean is Russia taking out military sites inside Finland before it joins NATO, because after it joins NATO, if it attacks Finland, that means nuclear war. So this is just a disaster. And for what? It's basically because Europe has subordinated its security to the US instead of trying to come up with what was the vision of Mikhail Gorbachev and German leaders, not the current one, but past ones, and other European leaders, for a common European security infrastructure in which everybody's interests were acknowledged, and not creating a US-led hostile military alliance that by definition treats anyone who's not inside of it as an enemy. So when you have a hostile military alliance expanding increasingly to Russia's borders, it's a disaster. And this, unlike, Iraq or Libya or other targets of US regime change wars, Russia can fight back. It has nuclear weapons. So ultimately what all these moves are doing is just bringing us closer to the unthinkable, which is nuclear war. It's just crazy.
Here's what Steve Schmidt, the genius who brought you John McCain and Sarah Palin, had to say. Steve Schmidt said, Finland and Sweden joining NATO is a momentous event. In an instant, the most powerful military alliance in world history has been made even stronger. These modern, free, powerful, pluralistic Arctic powers should be celebrated. This guy, again, has been braced by the Democratic Party now because he's anti-Trump. So a maniac like that who brought you Sarah Palin and John McCain and is now pushing for World War III. He's considered a sage by people at MSNBC and people who vote for Joe Biden. He's considered a truth-telling sage because he doesn't like Trump. Here's another one. I don't know who this guy is. He says, Putin on Finland and Sweden joining NATO. This is what Putin says. Russia has no problem with those states, meaning Finland and Sweden. So there is no direct threat from expansion to those countries, meaning he doesn't mind if NATO expands, but deploying military infrastructure will provoke a response based on the threats they create for us. So you can let them join your group, your NATO, but don't put any military installations in their countries, because then we're going to take them out.
But Jimmy, that's the problem. Once you're in NATO,
you have to.
You're bound.
You're bound
to the military alliance, including you're also bound to join a war. So if the U.S. gets into a war with Russia, then Finland and Sweden are bound legally to fight on the U.S. side. That's the danger of it. So yeah, sure. And look, what Putin is talking about there is a part of the major background to the Ukraine crisis. The Ukraine war is not just about Ukraine. It's also about, for the last 20 years, the U.S., in a move that was essentially engineered by John Bolton. So again, this is, anybody on board with this is doing John Bolton's bidding. Dismantling arms control treaties. Bolton under Bush dismantled the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the ABM. And the official pretext was that we need to do this to protect Europe from Iranian missiles, which is a complete joke. I don't even think Iranian missiles could hit Europe. And if they could, Iran launching missiles at Europe would mean Iran's destruction. So yes, that's a scam. The real reason is to free up the U.S. to build offensive military sites, which they've done in Poland and Romania, that can be aimed at Russia, which is the background. And then on top of that, under Trump, when John Bolton came back, he pulled the U.S. out of the INF Treaty, which had eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. So now Bolton doing that with Trump's support allows the U.S. and Russia to build up more nuclear weapons that had previously been taken offline. Trump also killed the Open Skies Treaty, which allows the U.S. and Russia to patrol each other's territory to ensure that they're not building up these kinds of scary weapons. And so Russia, before the invasion of Ukraine, was not just trying to put proposals on the table that could resolve the Ukraine crisis, namely the Minsk Accords, which was the peace settlement that everyone supposedly supported, and Russia was trying to get that enforced. But also Russia put out these draft treaties to both the U.S. and NATO that called for these issues to be addressed, that called for ending the position of offensive weaponry on both sides. So Russia was saying that we will take away our offensive weaponry aimed at your territory if you take it away aimed at ours. And essentially, all this was dismissed. The U.S. did not want to seriously negotiate. The U.S. said that there was some room for discussion on some marginal issues, but not on the core issues. And that's a major part of the background to the Ukraine crisis. And now it's escalating to this point where instead of trying to address these concerns and engaging in serious diplomacy, the U.S. and its allies are doubling down by expanding NATO and creating the threat of even more conflict.
And let's listen to Noam Chomsky tell us what's the real point of NATO now. Since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, now what is the point of it? And here's what he says.
The question that we ought to be asking ourselves is, why did NATO even exist after 1990? Throughout the whole history of the Cold War, we were told NATO is necessary to defend Western Europe from the Russian hordes, okay? No more Russian hordes. What happens to NATO? It expands, okay? It expands to the east. Its mission changed. Its official mission now is not to defend Europe from the Russian hordes. It's to control the global energy system, sea lanes and pipelines, and to serve as a U.S.-run intervention force. Well, you know, we're all educated intellectuals. We can now ask a question. What was the nature of the propaganda we were fed all those years? I mean, if NATO was there to defend the West from the Russians, why is it now expanding right to the borders of Russia, becoming a global U.S. intervention force, protecting sea lanes and pipelines and so on? What that tells us is all the talk about the Cold War was just a pure lie. And there's plenty more evidence for that, which we could go into. Educated intellectuals don't pursue this line of thought, but it's a pretty obvious one. Well, going on to Ukraine, Mearsheimer's point is that for any Russian leader, whoever it might be, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Ukraine is right at the core of their geostrategic concerns. For Ukraine to be taken into NATO, which is what is repeatedly threatened, would be a very serious threat to Russian security, quite apart from historical interests, which go way back, the origins of the Russian Empire, in fact. So yeah, you can give arguments against Russian interference in eastern Ukraine after the coup that took place there, but it's a complicated story, and the West is not without its significant initiatives there.
So there you go. That's what's going on there. And the NATO only exists so we can secure the energy transfers around the world, which is exactly what this is about. This is about the United States. The first thing they did was they made the pipeline called Nord Stream 2, which comes directly from Russia to Germany. They made them stop. Why? So the United States could now fulfill Europe's liquefied natural gas. We want bigger part of that market. Russia now gives 40% of the energy to Europe. We want part of that. And so that's, of course, what this is about, among other things. I just want to point this out, that Turkey will not say yes to NATO membership for Sweden and Finland. So why is that, you think, Aaron? Why do you think Turkey's against it?
Well, Turkey tried to maintain a relationship with Russia, even though it's contradictory. They're on opposite sides in Syria. Turkey supplied weapons to Ukraine, so I don't know exactly what is driving this decision, but also Erdogan's very erratic. So I wouldn't be surprised if he turns around and supports these countries joining NATO. But look, Chomsky made a great point there. So, NATO is not just there to encroach on Russia and to justify military expenditures. It's also an offensive military alliance. Just ask the people of Libya. And so people inside Finland and Sweden ought to consider that. Do they want to send their kids off to go fight in regime change wars like the next Libya? Or do they want to help turn countries like Libya was into slave states? I mean, that's really what they're signing up for under the belief that they're defending themselves from Russia. What they're actually doing is integrating themselves into a hostile military alliance led by the U.S., and that could entangle them in all sorts of dangerous things, as NATO's own recent record shows.
So here's the celebrated journalist, Lyra Gonzalo. He says, no, there will probably be no war over Finland and Sweden joining NATO, but both countries will get cut off from Russia food and energy. further sinking all of Europe. Understand, Europe is committing economic and geopolitical suicide. European prosperity is gone forever. What do you agree with that assessment?
I mean, I wouldn't be so declarative, but I think that's a very real threat. Absolutely. These countries, especially Germany, are sabotaging their own economies to essentially follow U.S. orders. It makes sense. Russia is right there, whether you like it or not. Russia is a part of Europe, and Russia's energy has powered so much of Europe. And now you want to just cut it off? Why? So the U.S. doesn't look embarrassed by pledging to keep Ukraine neutral? Because again, that was Russia's core demand. Just say the words that Ukraine will be neutral. Ukraine can still join the European Union, but in terms of a military alliance, Ukraine will be neutral. Just as we would ask if China was trying to bring Mexico into a China-led military alliance, the U.S. would demand and use weapons to ensure that Mexico stays neutral. So what Russia was demanding was pretty reasonable. We've played the clip before where Zelensky even admitted that he was told that Ukraine wasn't going to join NATO anyway, but that publicly the door will be left open essentially to bait Russia. So for the mission of baiting Russia, you want to sabotage your own well-being? It's madness.
I agree. All right. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. NATO is continuing to expand all they can. It's I make jokes about it because that's what I do for a living, but it's really, I mean, if I remember 40 years ago, Sting did a song when we were in a Cold War with Russia, and he said, if the Russian people love their children too, maybe you guys will want peace and stop this nuclear arms race. And it was a very popular song. I don't know if it went to #1, but I bet you it was in the top 10. And it was, if the Russians love their children too. And here we are in a much, much, much more perilous situation, because it seems like the people who are pushing this are complete puppets. Like Joe Biden isn't making any decisions about any of this stuff. Joe Biden is being told what to do by his handlers that work directly for the military-industrial complex. So he's not making any decisions. So it seems like the people who are doing that are actual fucking maniacs, and Joe Biden's just demented puppet. And so that's why, like, before, Barack Obama actually was sane. He had his faculties. He was of sound mind. And he stopped arms shipments to Ukraine because he didn't want to ramp up a war with Russia, because even though he's beholden to those same people, he wasn't as big as a maniac as the people he was beholden to. Joe Biden has got no faculty to stop any of this. So now you're seeing what happens if the head of Raytheon was running our foreign policy. That's exactly what's happening right now. There's no middleman anymore. Joe Biden is not doing anything. Isn't that amazing, Aaron, that we can sit here, you and I both know our president is far gone demented. We know he's not making any of these decisions. Who do you think really is making the decisions? Certainly isn't Kamala Harris. This is not a Dick Cheney situation.
This is a neocon foreign policy, and Biden surrounded himself by neocons. Blinken, the Secretary of State, Jake Sullivan. These are the people who played a big role in the dirty war in Syria. It was Jake Sullivan, who's supposedly now in charge of our national security, who wrote to Hillary Clinton 10 years ago and said, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria.
Yeah.
So these are the minds that we are dealing with, people who would rather side with Al-Qaeda if it means overthrowing governments that are a curb on U.S. hegemony or are not under the U.S. umbrella. That's how devoted these people are to hegemony. And that's who's running our policy. And I agree with you. It's very scary. You mentioned the 80s when Sting wrote that song. Millions of people went out to Central Park, protested. And those protests helped get us the nuclear arms control treaties that Trump killed and that Biden is doing nothing to revive. And what he's doing is ramping up tensions that will allow those nuclear weapons to be used. It's a freaky time.
Everybody check out Aaron Mate on his show Pushback at the Gray Zone's YouTube channel. Also, check out his writing at his Substack, mate.substack.com. I'm a subscriber. I get emails all the time. All right. Aaron Mate, thank you very much for coming on and letting your expertise. I appreciate your anti-war journalism.
I appreciate you, JD. Good to see you.
Hey, I'm on tour. Come see me in Irvine, California, Las Vegas, Indianapolis, Salt Lake City, Washington. Washington? You mean Washington State?
Yes.
Yes. Go to jimmydorecomedy.com for a link for all those tickets.